Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. I'm a local physician, educator, activist, curmudgeon, and my guest today is Mary Peveto from Neighbors for Clean Air. Take a deep breath if you dare, because today's topic is air pollution. Together, air, water, soil, chemical, and occupational pollution cause over 9 million deaths worldwide each year, or 1 out of 6 deaths worldwide. This is 3 times as many deaths as malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS combined. Today we will focus on air pollution, which consists of a number of factors. Carbon dioxide and other hydrocarbons, the major contributors to global warming. Ozone, which at high altitudes protects us from the sun's ultraviolet radiation, but at ground level is toxic. Particulates, heavy metals, including mercury, lead, arsenic, and cadmium, which are neurotoxic and associated with a variety of neurological problems such as autism, ADHD, lowered IQ, anxiety, depression, aggression, and even social and developmental delays, as well as certain cancers. And there are other chemicals in air pollution too. Air pollution is responsible for 200,000 premature deaths each year in the United States and another 7 million premature deaths worldwide. That's 1 out of 8 deaths globally. Half of these deaths are due to indoor air pollution, primarily due to the use of indoor cooking stoves by the world's poor, with women and children disproportionately affected. Another half are due to outdoor air pollution, the focus of today's program. Worldwide, global warming causes 400,000 deaths and between 5 and 5.5 million disability-adjusted life years lost annually, a number that is expected to double by 2030. Air pollution causes lung cancer and asthma, impairs lung development and function, and is felt to trigger 7.5% of heart attacks worldwide. Deaths from cardiopulmonary diseases correlate with air pollution levels in U.S. cities, both day to day and over time. Air pollution causes an increase in hospital admissions for congestive heart failure, arrhythmias, stroke, asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, and peripheral vascular disease. Higher exposures to air pollution increase one's risk for lung, breast, liver, upper digestive, and pancreatic cancers, diabetes, blood clots, rheumatoid arthritis, kidney failure, migraines, dementia, poor sleep, and migraine headaches. Air pollution also impairs sperm production and increases the risk for premature birth, preeclampsia, low birth weight infants, and birth defects, including neural tube defects and circulatory system malformations. Greater exposures to air pollution are linked with more days lost from work and school, even an increased risk of suicide. There are 6 trillion tons of over 85,000 chemicals produced annually, many of which end up in the air that we breathe, usually without our knowledge, due to lack of transparency by industry and inadequate regulations governing their use and release. Over 30,000 pounds of chemicals are manufactured or imported per U.S. citizen per year, and while many have made our lives significantly better, most have never been screened for toxicity. Therefore, the onus for proving toxicity is placed upon underfunded, independent scientists who must conduct expensive, long-term, and difficult-to-interpret studies and then petition the government for increased regulation. There are 85,000 known or suspected hazardous waste sites in the U.S., and almost 1 in 4 U.S. citizens lives within 4 miles of a Superfund site, those most toxic wastelands that may never be completely cleaned up. And really, none of us are safe, as half of us live within 10 miles of such a site, and we all breathe the same air and use the same water, whether for drinking or recreation. When corporations pollute and are caught, penalties are small relative to profits and considered merely a cost of doing business. Many deliberately site polluting factories, toxic waste dumps, and incinerators in lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods and those with higher concentrations of people of color, a phenomenon known as environmental racism. Air pollution costs the 34-member Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries almost $2 trillion per year, costs Europe $1.6 trillion per year, China $1.5 trillion per year, and India over $500 billion per year. The 1972 Clean Air Act led to significant reductions in air pollution and is estimated to have contributed 15% to the subsequent increase in life expectancy in major U.S. metropolitan areas, along with saving $22 trillion in healthcare costs over the last 4.5 decades. Yet the benefits have not been evenly distributed, and much remains to be done. In the U.S., transportation accounts for 29% of energy consumption, industry for 25%, residential use for 12%, and commercial use for 8%. The top sources of fuel for all U.S. energy consumption combined are oil, natural gas, and coal, with a small percent coming from nuclear power and about 10% from renewable sources such as wind, solar, geothermal, and hydroelectric power. Worldwide, annual fossil fuel subsidies amount to between $775 billion and $1 trillion, not including the costs associated with climate change, environmental destruction, militarization and war, refugees, and health impacts. Including these so-called externalities brings the societal cost of fossil fuels to over $5 trillion annually, or $10 million per minute. For comparison, total global spending on healthcare is $6.5 trillion per year. Compared to the true cost of fossil fuels, that is, including such externalities, renewables look great. However, since external costs are buried elsewhere and paid off by taxpayer dollars, it is easy to understand why some of the most profitable corporations worldwide are oil companies. To facilitate such taxpayer largesse, the oil, gas, and coal companies spent $354 million in campaign donations and lobbying and received $29 billion in federal subsidies over the 2015 to 2016 election cycle, a spectacular 8,200% return on their investment. As Will Rogers said, we have the best Congress money can buy. Fossil fuel companies also rely on aggressive public relations campaigns, corporate front groups with eco-friendly names, astroturfing, or the creation of artificial grassroots coalitions, advertising, strategic lawsuits against public participation or SLAPP suits, and the support of lapdog scientists willing to sell their services to such companies to obfuscate data and or hide important findings from regulators and the general public. Worse yet, some cash-strapped school districts have adopted sponsored environmental education materials, free, pre-packaged environmental science curricula designed to promote fossil fuels. For example, Exxon's Energy Cube curriculum contains statements such as, gasoline is simply solar power hidden in decayed matter, and offshore drilling creates reefs for fish. Well, technically true, but certainly misleading. And industry is having a field day with the current administration led by President Donald Trump, although by airtime who knows, who has called climate change a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese and who fails to comprehend the distinction between weather and climate. He is an ecocidal, proudly ignorant, sociopathic, warmongering, racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic narcissist and admitted sex offender who seems to lack fundamental human qualities like empathy and has filled agencies and cabinet positions with corporate flunkies who have, in a few cases, called for the elimination of the very agencies they represent. These nominal agency heads have made a concerted effort to silence government scientists and to roll back environmental and health regulations. With the complicity of Congress, some timid scientists, a remarkable number of voters who still support Trump and his agenda, and even some religious organizations, they are trading our future for short-term gains, which will, realistically, go to the top income brackets, leaving our children with a barely recognizable planet that may, even with massive future investments, be beyond repair. Yet despite our over-reliance on fossil fuels, an energy policy blind to the health and well-being of the planet and its inhabitants, and an abysmal federal policy agenda, there is some good news. More Americans are employed in clean energy jobs, which are higher paying and offer greater long-term stability than by the fossil fuel industry. Both the City of Portland and Multnomah County have passed landmark resolutions committing to 100% clean, renewable energy by 2050. And acceptance of the need to act now is growing, especially among young people. Nevertheless, Trump strongly supports the economically moribund coal industry, despite the reality that there are almost 500,000 Americans working in solar and wind energy combined, compared with only 50,000 in coal. In fact, there are more professional dancers than coal miners in the United States. One wishes Trump would instead call for increased funding for the arts. And imagine how different the world would look if we had heeded Thomas Edison's advice in 1931 when he said, "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until coal and oil run out before we tackle that." My guest today is Mary Peveto, who earned a BA in history from Macalester College. We will talk about air quality here in Oregon and what our local and state governments can do to improve it. Mary began her professional career in the athletic industry, working in marketing and communications. She became, in her own words, an accidental advocate or activist when she co-founded Neighbors for Clean Air in 2010. As its president, she has become one of Oregon's foremost experts on air regulations and has built a grassroots movement representing frontline communities impacted by toxic air pollution. She has served on the Cleaner Air Oregon Rulemaking Advisory Committee, the U.S. EPA Clean Air Advisory Committee, and the Portland Air Toxic Solutions Advisory Committee. Whew. Mary also serves as chair of the Multnomah County Advisory Committee on Sustainability and Innovation, its subcommittee on air toxics, and does more work than I can imagine anyone doing in a 24-hour day. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be here.
Tell me, how did you get started in activism?
By not knowing anything about what you just took us through. I got started as I said, it was a very local issue. I'm a mother of 3 kids, and frankly, I don't really call myself an accidental activist anymore, because when you're a mother trying to protect their kids, it's not accidental. But there was evidence that we had a high amount of industry pollution in our neighborhood that potentially could put our children at risk, and I knew we had to do something about it, and I slowly kind of walked my way into this rabbit hole.
And you ran into some really surprising findings about the air in your children's school district. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, what I found was, and I was looking for the school to lunch, farm to school lunch program, but I came across industrial air pollution in our kids' schools and found that my neighborhood school in Northwest Portland was ranked in a national study in the bottom 2% of the nation because of just the industry pollution. And then I quickly, you widen the aperture, and I learned that no school in the Portland metro area was better than the bottom 30%. So I knew we had an industrial air pollution problem, but then I also pretty quickly learned we had a broader air pollution problem, and frankly, none of this is captured by any, there was really nobody working in this world of, the health impacts of air pollution.
Mm-hmm. And that's surprising to many of our viewers, I'm sure, because Portland is often thought of, as is the Pacific Northwest in general, as a very green, healthy place to live, beautiful, fresh air. We've got the lovely mountains and the trees. And it sounds like this came as quite a shock to you also.
Yeah, it was a huge shock, and I think it is the distinction between that air pollution that we understand as smog,
right,
and that, frankly, our federal government has done a really effective and good job. As you said, the Clean Air Act has, since 1972, has been working very hard in this space. And so with 6 enforceable standards for 6 pollutants that cause smog, and some of them are the ones you talked about, the carbon and the ozone and others, it's been incredibly effective. Unfortunately, there are 187 other classified toxic air pollutants in our air at any given time that are known to cause cancer. That's how they make it onto this list of pollutants. And there are no federal regulations or standards for these.
And what are the major pollutants in the Portland area?
So in the Portland area, our state actually almost 10 years ago identified 17 different toxics in our air that are at levels that are known to cause health problems. The biggest driver is diesel particulate emissions, so these particles that get burned out of diesel engines, construction, and trucks that you can see the black smoke. But then the others are a suite of heavy metals that are more associated with industry pollution.
Right. And when we think about heavy metals, some of you might be familiar with Minamata disease, methyl mercury poisoning that Eugene Smith so beautifully documented in photography. But those effects of mercury are still being felt worldwide. And the mercury really makes it globally into the fish, works its way up the food chain, and we end up eating it. I grew up in Los Angeles, and as a kid, there were many days it seemed like you could cut the air with a knife. And I think I was as surprised as you, because often the air looks really clean, but it's what you're not seeing and breathing that's what's causing the problem.
Exactly.
Why is it that 40 years after the Clean Air Act was passed, we haven't seen a greater reduction in air pollution?
So I have to say we have seen a great reduction in those 6 pollutants that the federal government did a really good job with the Clean Air Act addressing. What we haven't seen a great reduction in is this suite of other pollutants that there are no federal standards. And so what was expected was that the states were going to figure that out, that's where local action would really kind of fill in that gap. But the states have really suffered, and some have moved farther ahead. And you talk about California. California has some really great programs in place. And what's really exciting about what's happening in California is they've been in place long enough that they can actually go back and see that the health of the children, lung function, and diseases associated with the air pollution has actually been reduced because of these efforts. But unfortunately, it isn't across the board, and Oregon has been one of these states where we just haven't been more aggressive to go after industry and go after these like diesel pollution that would cost a lot of money to change out into new technology.
Tell our viewers about Cleaner Air Oregon, and maybe even step back a little bit and tell us about what preceded the Cleaner Air Oregon program and how that came into being.
So Cleaner Air Oregon was initiated 2 years ago by the governor, and that was an astounding step, because yes, if I step back 10 years before Cleaner Air Oregon, that's about the time I was discovering that we had a problem of toxic air pollution, and it was really a hotspot problem. That if you lived, across the state of Oregon, anywhere you live near a large Title V, which is the largest source category of source of pollution from industry, you have a hotspot of toxic metals or industry pollution. And so the state in 2009, this Portland Air Toxic Solutions program, was one that was going to look at the geographic area of the Portland metro area and say, okay, let's look at all the sources and let's figure out how we get to making reductions. But at that time, again, they were still looking at proportionality. They really weren't, we don't measure and monitor for air quality at our really hyper-local levels. And so we were still reliant on models and broad numbers that didn't really give a very clear picture to any community about the problem. And so the Portland Air Toxic Solutions, unfortunately, was very bereft of any solutions. There were no mandates to say we have to reduce. This was the problem that I found, faced my community and most any community. We ended up having to work directly with a source of pollution and just do it as a good neighbor agreement that they would actually do 17 pollution reduction actions, and we were able to successfully get reductions that way. But the state was unwilling to, at that time, create any mandate. Fast forward to 2016, the U.S. Forest Service was looking at moss and how moss might be used to measure the problem of air pollution.
And moss, you mean the green stuff that grows
on trees.
Gotcha.
Right, and they had seen out in the gorge and other places that the moss and the lichen are very impacted by air pollution, and they decided they wanted to look in a more complex airshed in the urban environment, and so they started taking samples of moss across the Portland metro area. And the results they were getting back were showing that in really specific areas there were incredibly high concentrations of heavy metals. And so they shared this data with the Department of Environmental Quality. The Department of Environmental Quality went back to some of those areas and actually monitored the air and saw that they were also seeing high levels in the monitored air. And they were able to really quickly pinpoint some industrial sources of pollution that were putting their neighborhoods at risk. And it was so egregious and so obvious that it was coming from industry. And this was the point we were making, is that this was really not being well monitored or measured in terms of these local impacts, that the governor stepped in and said, okay, we need to fix this. There is a huge gap between what's healthy and what's regulated, and we need to fix this. And so Cleaner Air Oregon was an initiative that she introduced in 2016 that would bring the Department of Environmental Quality together with the Oregon Health Authority, and to move our program to our industry air permitting program to a health-based standard for risk, and not just a technology standard for industry that was sort of a, we put that in place, now we've done everything we can. We don't care if it's safe or healthy to the community.
Right. It's astounding to me that it took so long just to go back to the scientists and say, let's get some data. Was there some industry influence that sort of dragged things out, a kind of lobbying for lethargy, if you will?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the Secretary of State, Dennis Richardson, who I don't think anybody would say is a liberal bias by any means, conducted an audit of his department, conducted an audit of the Department of Environmental Quality, and they looked at the AIR program over the last 20 years, since about 2001, and actually have seen a really marked decrease in the legislature's revenue support of that agency. And with that, we have this, nearly 50% of permits are backlogged in the Portland metro area where we have the highest concentration of the biggest polluters. They're not even getting to their basic job of getting permits renewed where there might be an opportunity to see improvements, much less a huge and robust program to actually center health and risk in the permitting program. So we have the support of also this analysis of the program to show that it has been a disinvestment by the state legislature and that it's really time that we prop up this program again and get it working.
So what is Cleaner Air Oregon going to do to change that?
So Cleaner Air Oregon centers health, the better information about, so instead of the companies having to report on about 40 of their toxic chemicals, they now have to report on 660 toxic chemicals that they release. And then that data is used to do a broader risk assessment and analysis. And then the companies are held, if it's a new facility, it's held to an aggregate risk, that, meaning that all that together can only present so much risk to the community that it imposes. And existing facilities also now, we're trying in the state legislature right now to ensure that the existing facilities also have a set risk allowance. And so what that allows is that then that risk and that health risk becomes the center of the permitting program. Again, not just a technology standard, because, for example, the company in my neighborhood, was fully compliant with all the technology standards that are set in its industry, and yet we could still identify 17 other actions that it could reduce pollution and the toxic pollution beyond that. And so we know that those technology standards don't keep up with modern, frankly, modern engineering, or certainly not the emerging science on risk.
Right. So other than contacting you at Neighbors for Clean Air or what'sinourair.org, and even considering volunteering with you, getting boots on the ground, getting people actually to go down and lobby, contact their legislators, ideally by phone or in person, what are some other things that people can do?
One of the things that's really coming out of these last few years is this, broad awareness of this. And so there are a ton of neighborhood level groups as well as regional groups that are working on this. I mean, if you're in Corvallis, there's Corvallis Clean Air. There's, Concerned Citizens for Clean Air in Newport. There's the Dalles has a group. And then we have multiple groups across the Portland metro area in many different neighborhood pockets. So there's always that, getting together with your local community and your neighbors and bringing this, sharing information and working together is really the best way.
And what are your next steps in the next, say, 6 months to 1 year?
Diesel pollution continues to be a really conundrum and a tough one to get at, but we also think that there's a lot of things we could do at the local area that would impact the most people where the highest diesel emissions are. And so we are about to, on March 21st, have a forum, basically, we're calling it Deconstructing Diesel, where we're looking at a suite of policy options. We've been trying to fight this at the legislature. The legislature is a really tough place to solve problems. We believe that there's a whole bunch that could be done in local policies that could better start unpacking this risk.
And I have to say, I'm very heartened by what the students in Florida are doing after the Parkland shooting. It gives me hope for the future of this country and the future of the world. And I would ask young people also to think about the sheer numbers involved here. 200,000 premature deaths in the United States, and certainly not to minimize the immense suffering that those families of the victims are going through. On a daily basis, 200,000 deaths per year amounts to many more teenagers than that. And we're talking about the most fundamental thing here, the air that we breathe. It's a straight shot from your lungs to the bloodstream to the brain and to the rest of your organs. Mary, thank you for the great work that you're doing. I'm going to make some concluding comments now. First I'm going to read you, this is an open letter dated September 12, 1977 from Robert Phillips of the National Peach Council to Dr. Eula Bingham, the Assistant Secretary for Occupational Safety and Health, opposing regulations limiting workplace exposures to DBCP, which is a chemical associated with involuntary sterility. And the letter reads as follows. While involuntary sterility caused by a manufactured chemical may be bad, it is not necessarily so. After all, there are many people who are now paying to have themselves sterilized to assure that they will no longer be able to become parents. If possible sterility is the main problem, couldn't workers who were old enough that they no longer wanted to have children accept such positions voluntarily? Or might some volunteer for such work posts as an alternative to planned surgery for a vasectomy or tubal ligation, or as a means of getting around religious bans on birth control when they want no more children? The same things are said today, albeit behind the closed doors of Mar-a-Lago and other places where corporate lawyers meet with elected officials to water down regulations. It's inspiring to know that people like Mary are working to improve our air quality. But it is incumbent upon all of us to get involved. For those interested in learning more, please log on to the Public Health and Social Justice website, especially its environmental health page, where you will find frequently updated, open access PowerPoint slideshows, articles, other video clips, and links to hundreds of groups working on myriad environmental issues. You can also find lots more information on the Neighbors for Clean Air website. And let us remember the words of Nobel Prize-winning writer Günter Grass. The first job of a citizen is to keep your mouth open, and we need clean air to do this. This has been Prescription for Justice. Please check out our other episodes on YouTube or through the Public Health and Social Justice website. I'm Martin Donahue. My guest has been Mary Peveto. Thank you again, Mary, and to our viewers for joining us.